Ontarians of all political stripes can celebrate the results of the June 7 election for one key reason. Fully 58% of eligible voters turned out in a high-stakes provincial campaign, yielding the most democratic outcome in nearly 2 decades. In a province that never broke the 5 million mark, more than 5.7 million people voted last week. Premier-designate Doug Ford arrives and walks up the stairs with Albert Wong, the chief aide-de-camp for Ontario Lieutenant Governor at Queen's Park on June 8, 2018. The inspiration and desperation flowing from the Ford factor in the Ontario election may be the reason behind the highest voter turnout in years, Martin Redcone writes. Renee Johnston, Toronto Star, 6 in 10 people voting may not sound like much to rejoice over. But it is much better than the last 2 Ontario elections, when barely half of all voters bothered to cast ballots. In 2014, a mere 51% of Ontarians voted. In the 2011 election, the turnout fell to an all-time low of 48%. Perhaps the province suffers from a guilty conscience because polling suggests most Ontarians aren't proud of their democratic deficit. Told that turnouts had tumbled to the psychologically important halfway mark, fully 2/3 of Ontarians said it called into question the legitimacy of our elected governments at Queen's Park, according to a survey conducted earlier this year by campaign research for the Toronto Star. Article continued below. Now, Ontario is no longer an outlier burdened by the country's lowest electoral turnouts. Last week's vote was a full 10 percentage points higher than in 2011, suggesting that a disconcerting downward trend has been reversed for the time being. What happened? Never mind who people voted for, why did they vote at all? We'll know more in the coming weeks as new survey data becomes available. But we already know from past research that a high-visibility election, whether highly competitive, highly contentious, or both, motivates people to show up on Election Day. Or, tellingly, before Election Day, in this campaign, an estimated 770,000 voters took advantage of advance polls, an increase of nearly 19% over the last election. That's a leading indicator that many more people believed their vote was too important to miss. We know that voters tend to stay home if they believe the outcome is a foregone conclusion. While it would be wrong to say that the 2011 and 2014 campaigns were predictable, they both produced surprising outcomes. It is fair to say that the 2018 election had heightened suspense. The dynamics and theatrics of this race doubtless drove turnout. PC leader Doug Ford was nothing if not a polarizing populist, capable of angering and motivating voters on both sides of the ideological divide to turn out, whether for or against him. Supporters would stop at nothing to elect him, while opponents would elect anything to stop him. NDP leader Andrea Horwath profited from perceptions of a Liberal collapse, and fears of a PC conquest to boost the NDP vote dramatically. Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne's unpopularity probably pushed many progressives into the NDP camp. Article continued below. One unanswered question is whether young Canadians and new Canadians turned out in larger numbers than before. We know that millennials helped bring Justin Trudeau's Liberals to power federally in the 2015 election, but we also know they were at least partly motivated by his promise to legalize cannabis, a one-time offer. Mid-campaign polling showed that much of the NDP's surge in support came from younger voters, but did millennials come through on Election Day? The NDP's popular vote of 34% marked a big increase from the 24% they won in 2014, but we don't know how much bigger it might have been had more young people voted. In the 1971 election that made Bill Davis premier, a solid 74% of eligible voters cast ballots. But in the 1981 election that gave him a comfortable majority government, turnout tumbled to 58%. With last week's turnout, we have come full circle. In between, from 1985 to 1995, turnouts hovered in the low 60% range, until starting a downward trend in 1999 that saw the percentages drop into the 50s, bottoming out at 48% in 2011. Now, thanks to the inspiration and desperation flowing from the Ford factor, Ontario's voter turnout has rebounded to where it was in the final years of the Davis era. While that offers some consolation, it is not grounds for complacency. For those who worry about the dynamics of Democratic engagement, the question remains, where would voter turnout be today in Canada's biggest province without Ford Nation? Martin Raycone is a columnist based in Toronto covering Ontario politics. Follow him on Twitter, @Raycone.